Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt and Senator Margaret Chase Smith face the nation. You're about to see the widow of the late Democratic President, Mrs. Franklin D. Roosevelt, and the only woman to have served in both the House and Senate of the United States, Mrs. Margaret Chase Smith, face the nation with questions from veteran correspondents representing the nation's press. And now the moderator of Face the Nation from CBS News and Public Affairs, Griffin Bancroft.
The man who regularly handles this program for you, my colleague Stuart Novins, is tied up in New York at the United Nations, covering some of that big, fast-breaking news that we're going to discuss here. This is a big day for Face the Nation. Not only is it our second anniversary, and not only is it the first time that we've had a woman as a guest, today we have two charming ladies, both top campaigners for their parties in the closing days of this campaign. Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt, and this reporter has crossed her path at Democratic meetings from Oregon to New York. And Senator Margaret Chase Smith of Maine, who is not facing re-election herself this year and so is out working for the Republican ticket. But a lot of things have happened to change the nature of this campaign in its closing days in the Middle East and in Eastern Europe, where men are trying to settle things with guns and not with votes. But before we get into all that, here now let me introduce our panel of newsmen. Mr. William Hines, the national editor of the Washington Star. Mr. Arthur Sylvester, Washington correspondent for the Newark News, and Peter Lissagore, diplomatic correspondent for the Chicago Daily News. And now, with the first question, Mr. Hines.
Mrs. Roosevelt, I know you've made clear your belief that Mr. Stevenson is going to win this election on Tuesday. I wonder if you'd mind telling us by what electoral vote you think he will win.
Oh, sir, I'm not a good enough politician to have any idea about such things. I'm not a prophet, and I really would have no idea. It seems to me, however, that as the last few days have been developing, that there can be no question in the people's minds of the failure of our policies in the Near East, which have now resulted in our making NATO weaker. Our alliance with our allies has so encouraged the Soviet Union that at the moment it looks as though they had taken courage enough to move in Eastern Europe on Hungary in a very dangerous way, and I can see, of course, nothing but anxiety in the minds of everyone who understands the situation in these areas of the world.
Senator Smith, I assume that you believe the Republican candidate is going to win, but I wonder what you think the chances are of his taking a Republican House and Senate with him in view of the results in your own state.
Yes, I do believe that President Eisenhower will win by a good vote. I wouldn't venture a guess on the House and Senate, Mr. Sylvester. Maine was a little different. We had a very popular Democratic governor who was running for re-election, and there were several other reasons why Maine went as it did, but it will go for Eisenhower.
I would like to ask both of you a question. The campaign seems to have come alive suddenly with the war in the Middle East, and I would like to ask you whether or not you think the American leadership could have prevented that war in the Middle East. I'd like for you to answer that first, Mrs. Smith, and then Mrs. Roosevelt.
Well, Mr. Lissagore, I think, no, I don't believe it could have.
I don't quite understand the question. Would you repeat it?
Could American leadership have prevented the war in the Middle East today?
Yes, I think so, if we had acted a long while ago. We did not move soon enough. We were partly held back by our oil interests, but these things don't happen overnight. They build up, and I think anyone who has watched the situation in the Middle East growing has been longing to see some kind of constructive action on the part of the administration for some time.
Well, Mrs. Roosevelt, isn't it true that this situation in the Middle East started building up as far back as 1948, when the Israeli and the Egyptians were at war and then
Quite
had an
true.
armistice?
That is why I said, sir, that our oil interests had held us back They held us back in a Democratic administration, but they've held us back even more in a Republican one.
Senator Smith, I wonder if you could give us some idea why the Eisenhower administration was able to go to the United Nations and condemn only Israel and leave out any of the surrounding circumstances of the provocation by Egypt and the other Arab nations.
Israel, as I understand it, was the aggressor nation, and of course the administration and our policy is against any kind of aggression.
Well, are
May
you
I have a
unaware?
chance to answer
Well,
that,
I just
too?
want to follow up with it. Are you unaware of aggressions against Israel over the last months and months?
No, indeed, and I think the United Nations should take that into account. I think they have been warring between themselves for a long, long time. I don't believe that we had any right to go in there other than through the United Nations to bring about peace, and I think that we've done everything that could possibly be done to do that very thing. I think President Eisenhower has done his level best to get Israel to quiet down, to have Egypt go along in a peaceful way.
I would like to say that I think it is quite clear and simple that Israel acted in self-defense. The things that the things that the dictator of Egypt has said clearly threatened Israel, and she knew that the strength was building up, military strength, provided a little of it by us to certain states when we refused to provide it to Israel, but largely by the Soviet Union, who have suddenly now become strangely on the same side in certain things with us. And so I think we have to realize that Israel actually acted in self-defense, and I hope it will be considered in the General Assembly, because while there always must be a sense of great feeling about any aggression, I think the proposal that has now been made by the Canadian delegate, and which we accepted the other night, of a border patrol of the UN for Israel, Israel immediately accepted that, as she had accepted before, and when Egypt rejected the proposal of Great Britain. And so I think it is fairly clear that there is an acceptance on the part also of Great Britain and France of UN control over the international waterway and takeover of the questions, which of course the Soviet has shown. I'm just wondering whether the Soviet would do the same in Hungary. And so I think that we must realize, if you've been in Israel, you would realize that every day there was an incident across the border. And if it was not in self-defense, I think there are very few actions that could be classed as self-defense.
Mrs. Roosevelt, would you be in favor of American troops being a part of a UN police action?
Well, I am just wondering, a few days ago the President said to the country that there was no reason for the involvement of American troops. Last night, or early in the morning hours, we endorsed the resolution of the Canadians, or the proposition, whatever you choose to call it, that there should be a police patrol. Now, I wonder if that's just words of endorsement. I think it's a fair question to ask of the President to clarify what he means.
Mrs. Smith, do you think the American Congress would approve of the use of American troops as part of a UN police force in the Middle East?
Mr. Lizigar, I couldn't speak for the United States Congress.
How do you feel about it?
I don't know. If it was the will of the United Nations and our government felt that that was the thing to do, of course I would feel so. My record would show that.
Mrs. Roosevelt, I'd like to advert back to your analysis of the start of this war involving Israel and Egypt. It sounded to me very much as if you were defending the concept of preventive war. Is that what you were undertaking to do?
No, I don't like the concept of preventive war at all. But I think that when there comes a point where you are openly threatened, there is a good legal backing to say that you act in self-defense when you wipe out an area of sources from which constant attacks had been coming.
But approaching this thing legally, ma'am, is it proper to react to threats by words with force?
No, I don't think it is, but this is more than threats by words, sir. This was action over a very long period of time. You must realize that there has been going on a situation where attacks have been going back and forth for a very long period of time. And for that reason, while I never think two wrongs make a right, just the same, I think you have to take into consideration the past and the provocation and what it meant to see force being built up by other countries in the way of material over a long period, and the fact that take the United States itself in days gone by. If it had been put as a younger nation in that position, there was no UN in those days, but I think we would have had some thoughts of whether we could survive. And I think that's what happened to Israel.
Well, when you made this remark about two wrongs not making a right, you were implying, weren't you,
I
that there were wrongs on both
that when
sides?
both sides
Yes.
cross and raid, neither side is right. You see, you can't call either side right, but it happens.
Well, with all this news, we're kind of forgetting that we are just ending a presidential campaign in this country, and both you ladies have been out campaigning. I'd like to find out how you think all this is going to affect the voters. What about you, Senator Smith?
I don't know. It makes a difference. If the people who have confidence in President Eisenhower, and I think the people do generally because of his great experience and his record, I think it will affect it and give him the votes. Now, if anything happens between now and Tuesday to change the situation, I don't know. I don't know of anyone who knows what is going to happen on Tuesday.
Mrs. Roosevelt?
Well, I don't see how anyone can have confidence in either President Eisenhower or Secretary Dulles' policies. Now, as a man and as a general, I respect him. He did a fine work. But the policies that have brought us into a position where we are, as far as the Near East goes, standing together with the dictator of Egypt and the communist Soviet, it's an odd situation to find the United States in.
Mrs. Roosevelt, may I interrupt right there? I wonder why you say we're standing with the Kremlin and with Egypt
Because
in the
there's
matter.
no one else in the UN with us.
Our policy is against aggression. Because we're aggression and other nations are aggression, it doesn't mean that we are standing with those nations. We aren't standing with the Kremlin, certainly on the aggression in Hungary.
No, but there wouldn't have been an aggression in Hungary if we hadn't encouraged them in the Near East. And the position today is, whether we like it or not, that for a time at least, it changed a little last night, but for a time at least, the votes with us were the Kremlin and Egypt,
Senator
and
Smith,
which was odd.
Pardon me, Senator Smith, do you feel that at the time when Nasser took over the Suez Canal, and we announced that we would not use force at any time, that we thereby threw away a trump that we might have had? In other words, going back to the way we acted in the case of Quemoy and Matsu and Formosa, we did not announce to the Red Chinese that we wouldn't use force. We left them guessing. Did we not hand Mr. Nasser exactly what he wanted to know when we told him in advance that we would not use force?
No, because I think we had formulated the policy of no aggression, and I think that any kind of force would be aggression. I am very proud and pleased and impressed with what President Eisenhower has done in this matter. For him to go through the United Nations, for us to go through the United Nations the way we did, and to say that we must go in an orderly, a legal way, rather than going off as Britain and France did. From what Mrs. Roosevelt said, I would gather that perhaps the warring between Egypt and Israel, which has been going along through the years, does not mean that either one is the aggressor. Perhaps Britain and France are the aggressors, which places an entirely different picture.
Do you feel then that we were wrong in not going to the UN in the case of Kimoy and Matsu?
I think the United Nations has been set up. I have great confidence in it, and I think it's been set up to solve international problems, and I think the more we use it for that purpose, the better off this government and the world's going to be.
I think we should have used it much sooner, much sooner. We waited so long that the world, many of the peoples in the world, had made up their minds. But I would like just to say one word about this. I think you have to remember that we have allowed the Soviet Union by our policies in the last few days to achieve what the Tsarist Russia had tried to achieve for years. They have their foothold in an Arab state. They have free access to Africa. They will control the Near East unless our policies change in the next few days. And I think you have to realize that they have also succeeded in separating us from our allies in NATO, with the result that that is probably what gave the Soviet Union the feeling that she could now move on Hungary. And I personally feel that if you go over what happened in chronology in the UN, that you will see how odd our situation is under the policies that we've been going through.
Mrs. Roosevelt, since it was Britain and France that actually broke the alliance and moved against Egypt, what else could the United States do but go to the UN and propose a ceasefire and the withdrawal of British and French troops from that area?
Nothing if you reach that point, but it seems to me an extraordinary situation that your closest allies act with, if you didn't know what they were going to do, then it seems to me an extraordinary lack of influence. We have lost touch with our allies. We have lost our influence with our allies. We are weak. We are alone. We are weak. Mr. Nixon says we have suddenly electrified the world by making ourselves free. What we have done is to become very much weaker. And I can't think, but you must say one or the other. Either we knew what they were doing and couldn't do anything, or didn't do anything, or and couldn't have any influence, which means that the American people were fooled because only a week before the president had told us that everything was going well and there was good news from the Near East. Or else we didn't know, and then we had allowed our relationships to deteriorate to a point which I think was extraordinary.
Senator Smith, I'd like to ask you a question about the Hungarian and the Polish situation. On the aid to Yugoslavia bill, you said, and I quote, that Tito appeared to be a shrewd international blackmailer who was playing both sides against the middle. And we should wake up to the fact that Tito is an example to other countries to do the same thing. Now, a good deal of the credit for the Polish uprisings and the Hungarian rebellion has gone to Tito for asserting his independence from Moscow. I wonder whether you feel the same way about that.
No,
now.
I do not. And I did vote, I have voted for aid to Tito, as you know, to Yugoslavia through the years, until he went to Russia and came out saying that Russia and Yugoslavia would go hand in hand in case of trouble. I just felt that we were making an example of Yugoslavia if we continued to give him aid to other countries who would say, well, we may do the same thing and the United States will always come to us.
Senator Smith, how did you look upon Nasser, who seemed to be playing the same sort of game with us?
I think Nasser thought that if Tito could get away with it, perhaps he could.
Wasn't he trying that, working
I
at
don't
that?
know that.
Really?
Senator Smith, we've had the unfortunate news today that Secretary Dulles is out of circulation for some time at least with a cancerous involvement in his intestines. That was announced at 3 o'clock. I wonder if you place the same confidence in the statesmanship of Herbert Hoover, Jr., the acting Secretary of State, that you have in the past placed in Mr. Dulles?
You're sort of putting words in my mouth,
I'm
but
not.
I
I'm
have
asking
great
you a
confidence
question.
in Mr. Hoover. I
You
think
do.
Mr. Hoover will make a very excellent acting secretary, and if necessary, perhaps go on through with the job that Mr. Dulles has been trying to do.
Senator Bender of Ohio sometime a few days ago said that Mr. Dulles was about to resign. Have you heard any such rumors as that?
Only what I have read of Mr. Bender saying in the papers.
Senator Smith, what did you find as you've been campaigning to be the main issues that are disturbing people, or are there any?
Oh yes, I think this world situation is very disturbing. I think people are very much concerned. I think they have been quieted a bit by the strong statement of the President that we would not become involved, that we would work through the United Nations. I think people are prosperous. The prosperity is the highest that we've ever had, which gives them everything practically that they want. People are working. I think people are rather contented throughout the country, except for the international situation.
Senator Smith, have you found any misgivings about Vice President Nixon in your travels throughout the country?
I haven't traveled, Mr. Lizagar, as much as has been intimated. I have only been out for the last week, except in my own state.
Mrs. Smith?
Well, I would like to say that I have not found everybody contented, nor have I found conditions good everywhere, and I have traveled.
Well, let us ask, we've been talking about the world situation here. What about some of these other issues? What about civil rights? Do you think there is an essential difference between the parties on that? How about you, Mrs. Smith?
Well, I think we have to respect the Supreme Court as the law of the land. I think we have to abide by the decisions if we're law-abiding citizens. I think the President has gone along with the Supreme Court. I think the Supreme Court, in all of its wisdom, saw the need to take time to do the thing that we're trying to have done. I don't know. Mrs. Roosevelt would have to speak, of course, for Mr. Stevenson.
And I think the President stated in Florida the other day that this was a question which the states would have to settle. And I just wondered if the states were going to settle it, how long it would be before a Negro could get registered in Alabama or Mississippi. Because if that's left to the states, it'll be a long day. So I just thought there were a number of things that should be clarified in the civil rights situation. But I would like to say this, that in the Republican platform there is no mention of the change of the Senate rule which allows the filibuster. And that, from my point of view, is the most important thing, because we will never get any civil rights through till the Senate rule is changed. And that is mentioned in the Democratic platform and is not in the Republican platform.
And Mrs. Roosevelt, the fact that you will not get any changes on any end to filibusters until Rule 22 is changed is primarily the fault of members of what party in the Senate?
Of both, I imagine it will be. It has been the Democrats in the past from the South. And that's why the Democrats from the South, having agreed to this, it will be something to hold over their heads.
Do you think
because it's in the Democratic platform.
Do you think it's more than just a platform promise?
No, not unless you have leadership in the White House which insists on using it.
Well,
and that I think will have when Mr. Stevenson is there, because Mr. Stevenson has forthrightly said in the South as well as the North that he would try to actively lead. The President has been rather, a little more vocal lately, but for the last years, not very on the subject.
Well, before this program started, this is the end of a political campaign, and we promised each of these ladies that they would have 2 minutes to make concluding statements discussing anything that they wanted to discuss. And by a toss of a coin, Mrs. Roosevelt is to have her 2 minutes first. Mrs. Roosevelt, you have 2 minutes.
I would like then to mention two things. One, the fact that I saw that someone had said that it weakened Stevenson's chances to have brought up the question of the hydrogen bomb tests. I would like to draw your attention to the fact that it has already been explained a number of times that the hydrogen bomb test is a menace to humanity, and that the last, or one of the people who has just lately said that medically it might affect our children, and is Dr. William F. Newman. who is the senior scientist with the AEC Medical Research Group at the University of Rochester. And there are many, many others who acknowledge that while they do not know the point, they fear. So that I'm not going to cover that, but I would like to say that for our security, the stopping of these tests has been acknowledged by some military authorities as being, at the present time, the best moment to stop it. And therefore, I think that was a very good issue to have discussed before the public, and I hope the public understands it. Secondly, the candidate on the Democratic ticket, Adlai Stevenson, has suggested that the draft is obsolete. That is because to train a jet pilot costs $100,000, and you turn them out at the end of 2 years. It's very expensive, and also, under the new law, only 1 in every 8 men will be taken into the draft, and that is undemocratic. And I think for the future of our young people, they would have better lives if they had intensive training for 3 to 6 months and then could plan their lives and their education. So both subjects, I think, were good subjects for discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Mrs. Roosevelt. And now, Mrs. Smith, you have 2 minutes.
Yes, I think we all want the H-bomb test stopped, but not until we have the guarantees that are demanded by President Eisenhower. The domestic policy record of the Eisenhower administration is told in the non-political finding made by McGraw-Hill that the American economy is more prosperous than ever before by almost any measure, a fact proved by statistics, not a mere political claim. The foreign policy record of the Eisenhower administration is one of the moral principle for peace against aggression, whether by friends or by foes. As one who has publicly condemned irresponsible accusations of treason and pro-communist against Democratic presidents and leaders, I condemn the current politically motivated charges that President Eisenhower is pro-communist and a supporter of dictators Peron, Nasser, and the evil men in the Kremlin. Americans, regardless of political party, resent such accusations against President Eisenhower because Americans believe in fair play. That our moral leadership in world affairs and world respect and confidence for our nation is the highest ever is proved by the record-breaking 65-5 support given in the United Nations, France, to our stand against the aggression in the Middle East, and by Britain and France and Israel standing with us in opposition to Russian aggression in Hungary. Domestic Democratic presidents, together with leaders of our allies, chose Dwight D. Eisenhower to lead our nation to victory in World War II and to head up NATO to stop the spread of communism. And reports go that a Democratic president thought he was so good that he asked him to be the Democratic candidate for president a while ago. It's strange to see and hear Democratic leaders now accusing him of not being a leader. Why the difference? It is clearly the difference between principles and politics.
Well, I'm afraid that's the end of all
general,
time.
Not a good policymaker.
And thank you, Mrs. Roosevelt and Mrs. Smith, for facing the nation. And our thanks also to today's panel of newsmen, Peter Lissagore of the Chicago Daily News, Arthur Sylvester of the Newark News, and William Hines of the Washington Star. This is Griffin Bancroft. We invite you to join us next week when Face the Nation moves to a new time over many of these stations. Check your local papers for the hour in your time zone. Our program originated today from Washington.
Face the Nation is produced by Ted Ayers, associated in production Harriet Cully and Beryl Denzer, directed by Clark Pangle. Today on the CBS Public Affairs program, you saw through the eyes of this live television camera Senator Margaret Chase Smith and Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt face the nation. Al Stepler speaking.